The summer sun over Charleston had no mercy. Amara Bell sat alone at the last table in the garden, the one nearest the ice station, the one nobody wanted, while laughter and champagne floated past her like she wasn't there. Her cream linen dress clung to her skin. Beside her, her 6-year-old son Milo kept his eyes down, small shoulders tight, because some of the guests had already made their opinions known about little boys who came to weddings without fathers. She was reaching for his hand to leave when the man crouched beside her chair and whispered, "Pretend I'm your husband tonight." If you've ever felt pushed to the last table in any room, stay with this story. And if it moves you, subscribe. New stories like this one every week. 3 hours earlier, Amara had stood in front of her bathroom mirror and told herself it would be fine. She had done harder things than this. She had delivered Milo, alone, in a hospital room with no one to hold her hand. She had rebuilt her credit after her ex cleared their joint account and disappeared. She had walked into Vale and Harbor Group's glass office tower on a Monday morning after her manager presented her summer resort concept to the executive board, with his name on every slide. And she had smiled, sat down, and kept working. She had done all of that. She could survive one cousin's wedding. Milo appeared in the bathroom doorway, wearing his pale blue short-sleeve button-down, the one he'd picked himself because he'd told her seriously, "It looks like the ocean, Mom." He was 6 years old and already had opinions about color theory. She'd combed his hair twice, and he'd immediately messed it up by pressing his face against the car window the whole drive over, watching the marshlands slide past like he was storing them for later. "Do we have to pretend to be happy?" he asked. Amara looked at him in the mirror. "What do you mean?" "At the party. Do we have to smile, even if it's not fun?" She turned and crouched to his level, straightening his collar. "We just have to be ourselves," she said. "That's enough." She believed it when she said it. Magnolia Tide Estate sat at the edge of the South Carolina coast, like something out of a magazine spread. White columns draped in wisteria, a broad lawn that rolled toward the water. Round tables dressed in linen the color of seafoam, ceiling fans spinning slowly overhead, in the open-air pavilion. The kind of venue that made ordinary people feel like they'd wandered somewhere they didn't belong. Amara knew the feeling well. Her cousin Talia's wedding had been planned for 18 months with the precision of a military campaign. 300 guests, a live jazz quartet, a cake that had its own Instagram page. Talia had always moved through the world with the confidence of someone who believed she deserved the best table in any room, and who made sure everyone around her knew exactly where they ranked by comparison. Amara and Milo were seated at the table nearest the catering station. Not the overflow table, technically, just the one nobody wanted far from the dance floor, half shaded by a magnolia tree, where the tablecloth had a small burn mark near the edge that someone had tried to hide with a floral arrangement. Around them, the closer tables filled with family and friends and partners and children who arrived in pairs. "Poor thing still hasn't found anyone." The whisper came from somewhere to her left, carried on the warm salt air. "The boy's been asking about his father again, apparently. Some people just make it harder on themselves." Amara kept her face still. She had a gift for that. She poured Milo a glass of sweet tea, pointed out a great blue heron standing motionless at the garden wall, and let the words pass through her like wind through a screen door. It was the iced tea that started it. Milo reached across the table for the pitcher, caught the edge with his elbow, and a wave of cold peach tea spread across the tablecloth. He froze, eyes wide, shoulders up around his ears, going very still in the way he did when he expected consequences. "See, that's the problem," said a voice nearby. Bryce Landon groomsman. 3rd-generation money and the particular kind of man who mistook cruelty for wit didn't bother lowering his voice. Kids without fathers don't learn table manners. Nobody to show them. A few people laughed. A few people looked away. The same result either way. Amara was already standing, already reaching for Milo's hand, already doing the quiet arithmetic of what it would cost her dignity to stay versus what it would cost her son to watch her leave. She had her answer. She was turning toward the exit when a shadow fell across the table. A hand, calm, unhurried, reached down and picked up the cloth napkin that had fallen to the grass, placed it neatly on the table in front of Milo. Then a man in an ivory linen suit sat down in the empty chair beside her son, leaned back like he'd been sitting there all evening, and looked out at the water. Dorian Vale. Amara had seen him exactly twice in person, once crossing the lobby of the Vale and Harbor building, once through the glass wall of a conference room where he was ending a meeting that had clearly not gone the way the other party hoped. She'd thought then what she thought now. He had the stillness of someone who had decided long ago that the world could wait. He didn't look at Bryce Landon. He didn't make a scene. He simply occupied the space like it belonged to him, which, given that his family's name was on the building 2 miles up the coast, it arguably did. Milo stared at him. Dorian glanced down at the boy with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was not nothing either. "Good instinct," he said quietly, nodding toward the spilled tea. "The peach is better cold anyway." Milo blinked. Then, very cautiously, he almost smiled. The photographer appeared 20 minutes later, with the particular energy of someone who believed his job was the most important thing happening in any given room. "Okay, we're doing the family portraits now," he called out, waving his arm in a wide arc toward the garden wall, where the late afternoon light came through the magnolia branches in long gold strips. "All complete family units, let's gather up, let's go. We want that light before it shifts." Complete family units. The words landed the way they always did. Not like a slap, more like a door closing somewhere inside her chest. Amara watched as the tables around her came to life. Husbands finding wives, fathers lifting children, grandparents being steered gently by the elbow toward the group. The natural migration of people who fit the category without having to think about it. She didn't move. Milo had been watching the photographer with interest, the way he watched everything, quietly filing it away. Now he turned to look at the gathering crowd. Then he turned back to his mother. His voice was careful, the way it got when he was asking something he already half knew the answer to. "Are we not a family, Mom?" The question was barely above a whisper, but it hit the open air between them like something solid. Amara felt the back of her throat tighten. She kept her face composed. She was very good at keeping her face composed, and she opened her mouth to answer. She didn't get the chance. Dorian Vale had not moved from the chair beside Milo. He had spent the past 20 minutes saying very little, which Amara had found both surprising and oddly steadying. He'd answered Milo's questions about the boats in the harbor with brief, accurate answers. He'd accepted a piece of bread from the basket without ceremony. He had not performed his presence the way wealthy men often did at events like this, announcing himself through volume or the gravitational pull of people wanting things from him. He had simply stayed. Now he stood slowly, and she felt, rather than saw, him step into the space just behind her. Not in front of her, not beside her in a way that would draw attention, just present. His hand rested lightly on the back of Milo's chair. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "Let me be your husband tonight." A pause. "Just tonight, so they don't get to make your son feel like something is missing from him." Amara went very still. She was a practical woman. She understood risk the way people understood it when they'd had to calculate it their whole lives, not as abstraction, but as arithmetic real numbers with real consequences. She knew exactly what was being offered, and exactly what it could cost. He was her employer. Technically the employer of her employer, which was somehow worse. If this came apart in the wrong way, it wouldn't just be awkward. It would be the story people told the single mother who brought her kid to a wedding and walked out on the arm of the CEO. It would follow her. It would follow the work she'd spent 3 years building inside that company. The work that already had someone else's name on it. She knew all of this in the space of 3 seconds. Then she looked at Milo. He was still watching the families assembling by the garden wall. His small hands were flat on the tablecloth. He wasn't crying. He almost never cried, which sometimes worried her more than if he had. He was just watching with the expression of a child who was learning, quietly and too young, that the world had categories and he was being sorted. Amara made her decision. She turned to Dorian and held his gaze for one long moment. Then she reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. "Okay," she said, quietly, like it cost her something. Because it did. What happened next moved through the reception like a current under still water. Invisible, but felt. Dorian placed his hand briefly at the small of her back as they moved toward the photographer. Not possessive, just present. The gesture of a man who had decided to be somewhere and meant it. The whispers did not stop, but they changed frequency. Talia from across the lawn went very still. Bryce Landon looked away first, and Celeste Rowan, who had spent most of the evening positioned at the elegant midpoint between the bar and wherever Dorian happened to be standing, watched from behind her champagne glass with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. Milo slipped his hand into Dorian's without being asked. Dorian looked down. Something shifted in his face, brief, unguarded, gone before anyone else could have named it. But Amara was standing close enough to see it. The respect came fast, and it was worse than the contempt. Within the hour, the same aunt who had seated Amara at the catering table was suddenly finding reasons to drift past, touching her arm, asking how she'd been, saying she looked wonderful in that dress. A cousin who had not spoken to her in 2 years materialized at her elbow, wanting to know if she was still at that design job. "Such interesting work. We always said you were so talented." Talia's mother, who had once told Amara at Christmas that being a single parent was a choice with consequences, now smiled at her from across the pavilion with the warm, calculating look of someone reassessing an investment. None of it was for her. She knew that with the same clarity she knew her own name. They were smiling at the man standing near her. They were adjusting their behavior the way a compass adjusted to north, not because they'd changed, but because the magnetic field had shifted. Amara smiled back at every one of them. She was fluent in this particular language. She had just never expected to be on this side of it. She found a quiet moment near the edge of the garden, while Milo crouched in the grass, examining something small and determined. He'd announced it was a roly-poly, and was conducting what he called an experiment involving a magnolia leaf and a stick. The harbor beyond the wall caught the last of the afternoon light in long copper lines. Dorian appeared beside her without announcement. That seemed to be his way. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He loosened the button at his collar, the first concession to the heat she'd seen from him all evening, and looked out at the water. "You're doing that thing," he said. "What thing?" "Smiling at people you don't like." Amara glanced at him sideways. "I smile at people I don't like all the time. It's called being professional." "It's called being exhausted." She didn't answer that. It landed too accurately to argue with. Milo looked up from the grass and said with great seriousness, "Mom, there are two of them," about the roly-polies. Then he went back to his investigation. Dorian watched him for a moment. Then, without looking at her, "Are you all right?" "Not with them." A pause. "With you?" The question was so direct and so unexpectedly gentle that Amara felt something in her chest do a complicated thing she didn't have a name for. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked that. Not as small talk, not as preamble. Just, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. He didn't push it. He just nodded slowly, like he was filing the answer away alongside the ones he didn't believe. Celeste Rowan found them 10 minutes later. She moved through the reception the way money moved through a room, smoothly, quietly reshaping everything it touched without appearing to try. She was dressed in deep sage green, with the kind of effortless fit that came from a tailor who knew her measurements by heart. She had the practiced social grace of a woman who had been trained from childhood to enter a conversation and make everyone in it feel like a guest in her house. She greeted Dorian first. Of course she did. "I didn't know you were bringing someone," she said. Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes moved to Amara the way a searchlight moved, methodical, illuminating. "Amara Bell," Dorian said. Not, "This is my wife," just her name, stated clearly, like it was sufficient. "Of course," Celeste smiled. "You work with the events team, don't you? At the group?" "Coordinate design," Amara said. Equally pleasant, equally careful. Wonderful. The word meant nothing, and both women knew it. Celeste turned back to Dorian and said something about a contract clause she wanted to revisit before the week was out, keeping her tone light, her hand briefly on his arm. The gesture of a woman reminding a room of a prior claim. Dorian listened politely and said he'd have his assistant schedule something. After she moved on, Amara said nothing. Dorian said nothing. Milo reappeared from the grass, holding a magnolia leaf the size of his face, presenting it to Amara like an offering. "I found you something," he said. She took it with both hands like it was exactly what she'd needed. The dancing started at 7. Someone dimmed the garden lights, and the string bulbs overhead took over, casting everything in warm amber. The kind of light that made people look like better versions of themselves. Softer at the edges, easier to love. The jazz quartet shifted from background music to something with a pulse, and the lawn filled with couples, moving in the slow, loose way of people who had eaten well and drunk enough to forget they couldn't dance. Amara stood near the edge of the pavilion with a glass of water she'd been holding for 20 minutes without drinking. Milo was asleep in a chair she'd pulled into a quieter corner, his magnolia leaf still in his hand, his mouth slightly open. She'd draped her cardigan over him, and he hadn't stirred. She was watching the water when Talia appeared. Her cousin had the particular brightness of a bride 4 hours into her own wedding, champagne-lit, triumphant, primed for a moment. She touched Amara's arm with the warmth of someone performing warmth. "Amara," she smiled wide, "you should say a few words. The mic is open. Family tributes. It's a whole thing. Come on." It was not an invitation. Amara had known Talia for 31 years. She recognized a setup when she was standing inside one. The idea was transparent. Put the cousin with no husband and no status in front of 300 people and watch her fumble. Give the room a story. Let Amara be the contrast that made everything else look more luminous by comparison. Amara set down her water glass. She was 3 steps toward the microphone when Dorian fell into step beside her. He didn't ask. He didn't check with her. He simply moved the way he'd moved all evening, with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a decision and saw no reason to announce it. And when they reached the small, cleared space near the band, he was standing beside her, like he'd always planned to be there. Amara took the microphone. She looked out at the assembled faces, the candlelit tables, her cousin beaming from the front row with a glass raised. She opened her mouth to give the expected thing, something gracious, something brief, something that would let her sit back down without incident. Dorian spoke first, not over her, beside her, to the room in the easy-carrying voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. Before Amara says anything about tonight, I want to say something about her. The room shifted. Talia's smile flickered. Most of you don't know that the summer programming concept that Vale and Harbor Group launched this season, the one that sold out every coastal property in the portfolio before Memorial Day, was designed entirely by Amara Bell. He paused, let it settle. Not adapted from her work, not inspired by her work from the original brief through the final execution. I reviewed the internal records myself. The silence had a different quality now. Amara stood very still. The microphone was warm in her hand. She was aware of Grant Selwyn somewhere in the middle of the room. She didn't look for him, but she felt the direction of his presence the way you felt weather coming. Her manager submitted it as his own. Dorian continued, his voice unchanged, the way he'd probably delivered difficult facts in boardrooms for 15 years. That's being addressed. But I thought the people in this room who care about her should know who they're standing next to. He stepped back. The floor was hers. She said something. She didn't remember afterward exactly what, something about Talia, something true, something that made people laugh and let the room find its way back to ease. She handed the microphone back and walked off the floor, and didn't stop until she reached the garden wall, where the harbor was dark now, and the lights from the far shore made broken gold lines on the water. Dorian followed. "You didn't ask me," she said. Her voice was even. She had worked very hard to make it even. "No. You just—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against the cool stone of the wall. "If people believe there's something between us, and now they do, they absolutely do, then everything you just said about my work becomes because of you. Don't you see that? You handed them the story." Dorian was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think about it that way." "I know you didn't." She turned to look at him. "That's the problem." It was the first time all evening she had seen something cross his face that looked like genuine uncertainty. Not discomfort, something closer to the feeling of a man realizing the map he'd been reading described a different landscape than the one he was standing in. He didn't have an answer. For once, he didn't try to find one. They stood at the wall in silence while the music drifted out from the pavilion, and Milo slept in the corner with his magnolia leaf, and the harbor held its light as long as it could. The investigation notice arrived 5 days after the wedding on a Tuesday morning. Amara found it in her company inbox at 8:14, sandwiched between a vendor confirmation and a facilities update, as if HR had decided that the packaging made the contents less significant. Pending internal review. Allegations of undisclosed conflict of interest. Temporary reassignment from active projects effective immediately. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop, walked to the window that looked out over the marina, and stood there for a while, watching the water catch the morning light, flat, indifferent, moving at its own pace regardless of what was happening on shore. The office was all glass and pale wood and expensive air conditioning, the kind of space designed to project confidence and calm, which made the atmosphere inside it that morning feel particularly dishonest. She could feel the attention from across the open floor plan, the glances that lasted a beat too long before sliding away. The sudden interest in laptop screens as she walked to the kitchen. She had become a story. She knew the shape of it before anyone told her she'd seen it constructed in real time. Single mother, CEO, wedding, convenient timing. People would assemble those elements without needing any additional facts. The facts were almost beside the point. Grant Selwyn stopped by her temporary workspace at 10. He was the kind of man who delivered bad news with the affect of someone sharing good news. Upbeat, even-tempered, nothing to hide. He asked how she was doing. He said these things had a way of working themselves out. He said if she needed anything, she should just say the word. She thanked him. She kept her hands flat on the desk. After he left, she allowed herself 10 seconds of sitting with what she knew the email was his. Not directly traceable to him, he was careful in the way careful men were. But the shape of it matched. The timing matched. The specific framing of undisclosed conflict rather than misconduct was the language of someone who knew exactly what allegation would land most efficiently against a woman in her position. Dorian called that afternoon. "I'm going to the board," he said without preamble. "I have the original file timestamps, the version history. There is no ambiguity in the documentation about who created that project." "Don't," Amara said. A pause. "Amara, I mean it." She was standing in the stairwell, the one place in the building without glass walls. Her voice bounced off concrete. "If you walk into a board meeting and defend me right now, after this weekend, after everyone already thinks what they think, you're not clearing my name. You're confirming it. You're making me the woman who needed the CEO to rescue her." Silence on his end. "I have spent 3 years in that building," she said. 3 years of being the most prepared person in every room and getting a third of the credit. I know how to fight. I know when to fight. What I can't survive is winning the wrong way. The words came out steadier than she felt. She had practice at that, too. When Dorian finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Tell me what you need me to do." "Nothing. Right now, nothing." Another pause. Then, "That's not nothing for me." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." She hung up and stood in the stairwell for a long moment with her palm pressed flat against the cool concrete wall, the hum of the building all around her, and worked through the specific loneliness of being right in a way that couldn't help her. That night, Milo was quiet through dinner. He arranged his food into regions on his plate, a habit he'd had since he was 4, and ate with the focused interior expression that meant he was processing something he hadn't found words for yet. Finally, while she was washing dishes, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Is Dorian coming back?" Amara kept her hands in the water. "What do you mean?" "He texted you. I saw the name." He paused. "Is he your friend?" She thought about how to answer that. She turned off the faucet and dried her hands and crouched down to his level the way she had in the bathroom mirror 8 days ago, in what felt like a different season of her life. "I don't know yet exactly what he is," she said. "But I should have been clearer with you from the beginning. What happened at the wedding, the pretending that, wasn't fair to you. I'm sorry for that." Milo considered this with the gravity he brought to most things. "He was nice to me," he said, "even before the pretending part." Amara looked at her son. "Yeah," she said softly. "He was." The document appeared in the board's shared drive on a Thursday morning. Amara didn't see it directly. She heard about it from a paralegal she sometimes ate lunch with, who texted her a single line. "They're saying you leaked the summer project to Harlow Group. There's a file. It has your name on it." She sat in her car in the parking garage and looked at that message for a long time. Harlow Group was Vale and Harbor's primary regional competitor. The accusation that she had passed the Summer Harbor Experience concept to them before the official launch was the kind of thing that didn't need to be proven to be effective. It only needed to exist. A formal document with her name attached to an allegation that specific would follow her out of this building, out of this city, into every reference check and LinkedIn search for the next decade. Grant had been thorough. She would give him that. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday. The Seabright Cove investor presentation, the full public launch of her project. The one that had been taken from her and handed back in the wrong shape, was 10 days away. The timing was precise in the way that only intentional things were precise. She was still sitting in the parking garage when her phone buzzed again. An unknown number. A voice memo, 43 seconds long. She pressed play. Dorian's voice. A conversation she didn't recognize, clipped at both ends. The appearance at the wedding was damage control, honestly. Image management. These things happen at events like that. The recording cut off. Amara drove home. She did not call Dorian. She did not call anyone. She put Milo to bed, read him 2 chapters of the book they were working through. A story about a boy who could talk to birds, which Milo had chosen because he said birds always knew where they were going. And she sat in the dark of his room after he fell asleep and listened to him breathe for a while. She had known on some level. Not consciously, not as a formed thought, but in the way that women who had been let down enough times developed a low-frequency awareness of the structure of things. The evening at the wedding had felt real. The moment at the garden wall had felt real. The stairwell phone call had felt real. But she had also believed real things before that turned out to be strategic. She was not angry. She was something quieter and more durable than anger. A settling. A recognition. The sensation of a door closing on something she hadn't realized she'd left open. In the morning, she typed her resignation. 1 paragraph professional, no elaboration. She printed it, signed it, and put it in an envelope with her key card. Milo ate his cereal and asked if they were still going to the beach that weekend. "We're going to Aunt Diane's in Savannah instead," she said. "It'll be fun. She has that garden you like." He looked at her over his spoon. "Are we moving?" "Just visiting." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he believed something was partially true. She cleared her desk in 20 minutes. She had always kept it spare, a habit from years of knowing that permanence was something you had to earn in increments. And she hadn't finished earning it yet. A small plant she gave to the receptionist. A framed photo of Milo at the beach. 3 notebooks she'd filled with project notes written in her own hand on her own time, so she took them. Grant passed through the office while she was finishing. He paused, looked at the box in her arms, and said with genuine seeming concern, "Amara, you don't have to do this." She looked at him for a moment, really looked the way she hadn't let herself look before, at the careful arrangement of his expression, the practiced quality of his worry. "I know," she said, and walked out. She left the resignation envelope at the front desk, walked through the glass lobby doors, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the full weight of the August heat. The harbor was 2 blocks away. She could smell it, salt and low tide, and the particular warm tar smell of summer docks. Milo was at day camp until 3. She sat on a bench near the water and opened one of her notebooks. Not the project notes, the other one, the one she'd been keeping for 2 years, and looked at the pages she'd filled with a different version of what a place like Seabright Cove could be, what it should be, what she had designed it to be before someone else decided what her work was worth. She read it through from the beginning, Then she closed it, put it in her bag, and started making calls about Savannah. Dorian found the sketch on a Friday afternoon. He had gone to her apartment because he had evidence printed, time-stamped, irrefutable. The recording Celeste had sent Amara was a 43-second clip cut from a 40-minute conversation in which he had said the exact opposite of what those seconds implied. He had the full audio. He had Grant's altered document alongside the original version history that proved the alteration. He had, for the first time in this situation, everything he needed. What he did not have was Amara. He had called ahead. No answer. He'd contacted the building's front desk, explained he was her employer, following up on an urgent HR matter, which was technically true, and the manager had agreed to let him leave something at the door. When he got there, the door was unlocked. She had clearly left in stages, intending to come back for the remaining boxes, and then decided against it. Inside the apartment had the specific quiet of a space recently vacated. The shapes of furniture against lighter patches on the wall where things had hung. A folded paper bag on the kitchen counter. A small oscillating fan on the floor, still plugged in, turning slowly back and forth as if waiting for someone to come home. On the kitchen table, weighted down by a coffee mug she'd left behind, was a single sheet of drafting paper. He almost didn't pick it up. It looked like a forgotten page, the kind of thing you left because it didn't seem important enough to pack. He picked it up anyway. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. It was a site plan, hand-drawn, detailed, the kind of careful architectural sketch that took hours. At the top, she had written, Seabright Cove Community, Draft Version 4, in the small, precise handwriting he recognized from project memos. Below it, the resort grounds had been reimagined from the inside out. The oceanfront lawn, which the current design used for private cabana rentals, had been converted into free public programming space. A notation in the margin said, no wristbands, no tiers, open gates after 4 p.m. The East Pavilion, currently a corporate event venue, was redesigned as a rotating community market. Another margin note, local vendors priority to single-income households, no commission under $500, revenue threshold. There was a small shaded area near the children's pool, labeled Quiet Garden, unstaffed, open access, benches, shade. Below it, in parentheses, for parents who just need somewhere to sit. He stood in her empty kitchen and read every notation on that page. He understood something then that he had been circling for 2 weeks without landing. He had watched Amara navigate this situation with a precision that he'd admired, and he could admit now, fundamentally misread. He had assumed her insistence on handling things herself was pride. Professional self-preservation, maybe, or the particular stubbornness of someone who had been underestimated enough times to overcorrect. He had been wrong. It wasn't stubbornness. It was knowledge. Amara understood the system she was operating inside, its levers, its biases, the exact way it would interpret every move she made with the accuracy of someone who had been studied by that system her entire career. She hadn't refused his help because she didn't need it. She'd refused it because she knew with precision he was only now catching up to exactly what kind of help made things worse. He had thought his resources were the solution. She had known they were a variable she had to manage. He set the sketch down carefully on the table and took a photograph of it before he left. That evening he called an emergency session with 2 board members he trusted. Not the full board, not yet, but enough to freeze the Seabright Cove proceedings until the documentation could be reviewed. He submitted Grant's original file timestamps alongside the altered version, flagged the chain of custody, and requested a forensic review of the anonymous HR complaint. His legal team had the full recording reconstructed and contextualized. By midnight, by Saturday morning, Grant Selwyn had been placed on administrative leave pending termination. The altered document had been pulled from the shared drive. The investigation against Amara had been formally suspended, and the head of HR had been instructed to send written notification to Amara directly, not through a proxy, not buried in a system email, but a formal letter with a signature on it. Celeste, when presented with documentation of her role in the recording and the smear campaign, did not deny it. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said with the flatness of someone who had just lost a game they'd played too hard, "I thought he would choose differently." It was the most honest thing she'd said in weeks. She withdrew from the partnership discussions the following day. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public unraveling. Just the woman who had wanted something badly enough to cross a line, and who now had to live on the other side of it. Dorian drafted a message to Amara, deleted it. Drafted another, deleted that too. What he wanted to say wasn't something that belonged in a message. It was something closer to an acknowledgement of the specific shape of what she had built, what had been taken from her, and what it had cost her to keep going anyway. He looked at the photograph of her sketch on his phone. He looked at the note in the margin for parents who just need somewhere to sit. Then he picked up the phone and called his director of development. The Seabright Cove presentation was held on a Tuesday morning in full Carolina summer. The kind of day that arrived already at full brightness, sky wide and cloudless. The Atlantic sitting flat and blue beyond the resort grounds, like it had been ironed smooth overnight. Dorian stood at the front of the outdoor pavilion before 43 investors and said nothing about the summer harbor experience for the first 6 minutes of his prepared remarks. He talked about the company, about the coast, about what the Vale and harbor name had meant for 3 generations, and what he wanted it to mean going forward. He talked about the kind of place a resort could be, not just for the people who could afford the best cabanas, but for the community that surrounded it, sustained. It gave it meaning beyond the quarterly revenue projections. Then he stopped. "The concept you're about to see," he said, "was designed by Amara Bell. Every element. From the original brief to the site plan to the community programming framework. Her name should have been on this from the beginning. It wasn't. That's being corrected today." He clicked to the first slide. Her name was on it, large and clear above the project title. Grant Selwyn was not in the room. He had been escorted from the building 4 days earlier with a severance agreement and a non-disclosure clause that his attorney had advised him to sign without negotiation. Celeste Rowan had withdrawn from the partnership discussions. The investors asked good questions. The presentation ran 20 minutes over schedule because there was that much to discuss. Amara was in Savannah when her phone rang. She was in her Aunt Diane's back garden, a narrow, overgrown rectangle of fig trees and climbing roses, and a bird bath that had settled permanently into the earth at a slight angle. Milo was attempting to convince a mockingbird to eat from his hand, which was not going well, but which he approached with the patience of someone who had decided the outcome was inevitable and was simply waiting for the bird to catch up. She looked at the screen. She let it ring twice. Then she answered. Dorian's voice was quieter than usual. "The presentation went well." "I heard." She had her former paralegal contact, had texted her a photograph of the opening slide. She had looked at it for a long time before putting her phone face down on the garden table. "The board has formally requested that you return," he said, "as creative director of the Seabright project. Independent contract, your terms, full authorship, credit on all materials." She watched Milo extend his hand very slowly toward the mockingbird. "That's not why I'm calling," Dorian said. "I know." A pause. "I owe Milo an apology. Directly, not through you." Amara closed her eyes briefly. She had expected him to explain himself to her, to lay out his case the way people with good intentions explain themselves when they believe the explanation was sufficient. Instead, he had gone straight to her son. "He's here," she said. "I'll put him on." She walked to the far end of the garden and stood under the largest fig tree while Dorian talked to Milo. She could hear her son's voice, brief, considered responses, the occasional "okay," and then a longer silence. Then Milo said, clearly enough for her to catch it across the garden, "Did you mean the pretending part, or did you mean the being nice part?" A pause. Then Dorian's voice, too low to hear the exact words, but unmistakably careful, taking the question seriously. Milo listened. Then, "Okay, that makes sense." When Milo brought the phone back to her, his expression was the settled kind, the face he made after something had been explained to him in a way that was actually true. "He said he's sorry for making me think something was real before it was decided," Milo said. "And he said the being nice part was always real." Amara looked at her son. "What did you say?" Milo shrugged with the easy authority of a 6-year-old who had conducted a satisfactory negotiation. "I said, okay." They met at a small dock on the edge of the harbor at the end of that week, at the hour when the light came down at a long angle and made everything it touched look like it was worth keeping. Dorian was already there when they arrived. No suit jacket. Linen shirt sleeves rolled standing, with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the water like a man who had arrived early because he wanted to, and not because appearances required it. Milo walked ahead. He stopped a few feet away and studied Dorian with the frank assessment of a child who had already decided something but wanted to verify it in person. Then he walked the rest of the way and stood beside him and looked out at the water too, in comfortable, companionable silence, the way Milo sometimes stood beside Amara when he didn't need anything from her except to be near her. Dorian looked down at him. He didn't crouch, didn't perform the gesture, just looked, with the expression of a man who understood he was being trusted with something that mattered. Then he looked at Amara across the short distance between them. "I'd like to do this right," he said. "At whatever speed makes sense for you and Milo. No performance. No pretending." Amara walked toward him. She took Milo's free hand, then she reached out and took Dorian's. The three of them stood on the dock in the late summer light, the harbor wide and quiet around them. And for the first time since the wedding, since before the wedding, since longer ago than she wanted to count, Amara Bell was not performing anything for anyone. She was just standing in the truth of where she was. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. 3 months later, the Seabright Cove Community Festival opened on a Saturday in late October, when the Carolina heat had finally softened into something bearable, and the light came off the water in long, clean lines. Children ran on the open lawn. Local vendors set up in white canvas stalls along the East Pavilion. A jazz quartet played under the string lights as the afternoon turned to evening. The gates stayed open until 9. Nobody checked wristbands. In the quiet corner near the children's pool, a small garden with benches and shade held a handful of parents who had found it without being told, just sitting, just breathing in a space that had been made specifically for them, without making a fuss about it. Amara stood on the small stage near the waterfront and spoke her own name into the microphone, without apology. Milo sat in the front row and clapped with both hands, the way children clap when they are proud of someone and have not yet learned to be self-conscious about showing it. Dorian Vale stood at the back of the crowd and watched, and did not try to be anything other than a man who was grateful to be there. Nobody was seated at the last table. Later, after the festival lights dimmed and the vendors packed their stalls, and Milo fell asleep in the back seat with his shoes still on, Amara sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the harbor as Dorian drove. She didn't think about Grant or Celeste or the 43 seconds of a recording that had almost convinced her that nothing real could survive contact with people who needed it to be false. She thought about the margin note on a sketch she'd left behind for parents who just need somewhere to sit. She had built that place. It existed now. Amara never needed a man to confirm her worth. She needed the world to stop pretending her work didn't exist, and the courage to keep building it anyway, even when no one was watching. That's the kind of story we tell here. Stories about people who don't give up on their own truth, even when the room puts them at the last table. If this one stayed with you, subscribe. There's more where this came from, and every single story is worth your time.